Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is how you can actually bring this into your small business. Again, I mentioned you might be the only person that works for you, or you might have a very small staff and you think, like, well, I can't make my product fully recyclable, or I can't use fully recycled products, or I can't donate, 10% of my profit. I can't donate my time. That's okay. You can think about different ways that your business is already being socially responsible, and you can think about ways that you can be socially responsible in the future in a way that's more responsive towards small businesses. So some of these things could be looking at reducing your carbon footprint. Now, take this with a grain of salt, because the idea of the carbon footprint, along with that recycling triangle that we know so well, these are actually concepts that corporations came up with in order to shift the responsibility for environmental issues to the consumer rather than the corporation. And so, obviously, if you're listening to this class, you probably know that I think it's the corporation's responsibility, for example, Coca-Cola, to use less plastic. I think it's McDonald's and Tim Hortons and all these companies' responsibility to reduce the waste that's going into the communities where they are located. But a lot of times, these corporations will lobby local governments and national governments to try and avoid any responsibility for the waste that they're creating. So, carbon footprint was created by corporations to shift the blame. So, I'm not saying you should go all in on carbon footprint, because I do think that it's kind of a misplaced idea. However, you can use a carbon footprint calculator to look at where your business is generating the most carbon. And for most businesses, where you're going to be generating the most carbon is going to be from driving. So, for example, one really easy way to reduce your environmental impact is by driving less. So that could mean taking transit, carpooling, trying to find events that are closer to your house, walking places, having your events like in a crowded area where lots of people can access it on foot, etc. And you might think, okay, well, that's just an environmental impact, but it's not. Every time one of us chooses to drive less, we are actually helping our social fabric as well by cleaning up the air, which can help reduce childhood asthma, childhood illnesses, things like that. It also makes a more pleasant environment for people to walk in, especially kids and older people. So anytime that you can reduce how far you're driving, how much you're driving, how often you're driving solo, you're doing good things for the environment and for your local community. Now, you can also, if you have employees, or if you think you might have employees, you can think about improving your labor policies. So what does this look like? Well, for me, I have decided that I'm not going to have full-time employees unless I can offer them a living wage, sick leave, healthcare, a 401k, etc. So even though I was at a point in my business several years ago where I could have expanded if I had hired somebody at like $12 an hour or $15 an hour, I decided that I wasn't going to, because I couldn't afford to take someone on full time with all of the benefits that they should have. And also by law, some of those you're responsible for providing. So instead what I did is I hired people part-time at a higher wage, like $20, $25 an hour, to do small projects for me here and there, rather than trying to hire somebody full-time that I couldn't properly pay. So I think that's really important to think about, like the kind of the long-term impacts of your hiring practices. And a lot of times people say, like, well, my business can't exist if I pay my employees a living wage. But then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what are you contributing to society at that point? Because what you're doing is you're making people work 2 jobs, 3 jobs. In the United States, only there is no state in the United States where you can earn minimum wage full-time and afford a 1-bedroom apartment. And on average, you would have to work 2.5 full-time minimum wage jobs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. And that's really problematic. And that's one of the reasons homelessness is such an issue in the United States, is because the minimum wage and the cost of living are so incredibly far apart. So for me, I'm not going to have employees until I can have my wages be up here with the cost of living. That's a decision that only you can make, right? One other way that you can think about social responsibility and environmental responsibility in your business is looking for materials. If you use materials in your business, whether this is like paper or envelopes, jewelry, wire, slime, cooking materials, etc., you can look for organic options, fair trade options, recycled options, recyclable options, compostable options, etc., and try and reduce your impact on the environment and also on communities through purchasing things like fair trade and organic. When we purchase clothes, when we purchase fabrics like cotton, purchasing organic can have a really big impact on the health of the people that are actually making that cotton or that fabric. And purchasing something like fair trade coffee, even just for your office, has a huge impact on the communities that are making those, who are growing and roasting that coffee, because they get paid better and they have better working conditions if they have that fair trade certification in general, right? Like if you have a certification for something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be inherently better, but I would say generally when people are aiming for those certifications, they probably have some better practices. One example of a certification that's a little bit of greenwashing is I think the forest something certification for paper, and it's like 100% pure new paper from trees, but they've got this like forest certification, and it has something to do with like how frequently they replant trees. But the better option is to just buy 100% recycled paper, right? So you want to sort of look at certifications with a grain of salt, but also, find out in your industry which certifications in terms of the materials that you're using could be useful for you to try and buy better materials. You can also do this with services. It's a little trickier, but you can look for businesses that pay their employees a living wage, that have good working conditions, that get really good results in like employee happiness surveys and things like that. And if you're using, service like email newsletter software or survey making or anything like that, you can try and look for companies that have a good reputation for being, have high worker protections, good working environment, high wages, etc. Another type of social responsibility that has come up a lot in the news lately is diversity, equity, inclusion, or what we call DEI. Now, a few years ago, a lot of big companies felt like pressure to create DEI departments and try and improve the diversity of their organization. What happened, though, was that A, they were never fully funded, B, they were never fully supported, and C, they were kind of left to disintegrate on their own because they weren't properly funded and they weren't properly supported. And so what happened is that these companies would maybe try and make an effort to make sure that their hiring practices were less biased. So maybe they have some additional Black people that work at their company now. But because they didn't actually look at the company and look at the working culture of whether that place was actually a safe and lovely place for Black people to work, they ended up having Black people who quit or were fired. And so they kind of are back to square one, and they're like, well, we did our job. We did this DEI thing. We hired some Black people. But they didn't actually look at the company and what the company was offering and the supportiveness of the environment to see if it was actually going to be a place where different minorities or different genders would feel comfortable working. And so if you are interested in DEI and if you're interested in improving your diversity, equity, and inclusion, you have to think about how am I committed to this? Am I just looking to hire somebody? Or am I committed to their growth? Am I committed to their prosperity? Am I committed to their health and wellness? And that's really where you have changes, like long-term changes that are happening, where companies aren't just trying to hire more people of different minorities or maybe gender inclusiveness, but they're also creating and fixing their workplace to a place where you can actually be supportive. And this is a really good thing to think about in general. Like, what kind of environment am I creating for my employees, maybe for my customers? Am I creating an environment that's supportive and that's going to help them grow? Or am I creating an environment that's exploitative and extractive, which is the problem that we have with capitalism, is that capitalism is constantly trying to exploit and extract from us. And part of social responsibility is pushing back on that and saying, like, while I acknowledge that, work in general is extractive, I want to make sure that I'm supporting my employees and that I'm making sure that they're healthy and well and taken care of and paid well enough to actually support themselves. That's really important. So we already talked about the difference between giving to a nonprofit and giving to mutual aid, but I also want to talk a little bit about thinking about, if you're going to be donating money, the difference between giving to an enormous global nonprofit like the Red Cross versus giving to a local, smaller organization. Most likely, on average, that smaller organization is going to use more of the money that they get for actual programs and actually giving it to people or supporting people. Whereas these very large multinational organizations like the Red Cross are going to have huge administration costs. So if you're thinking about setting aside a certain percentage, like 1%, 10%, I used to give a lot to Oceana, for example, or like the Natural Resources Defense Council. Those were like on my list of places that I regularly donated to. But those are big international organizations. So I've really focused instead to try and donate to small local nonprofits, or even better, a mutual aid organization, because mutual aid organizations don't have any overhead. They don't have wages because it's all usually typically volunteers. And so the money fully goes to the people who need it, or to they can purchase food to give it to people who need it, etc. Another type of social responsibility that any business can do is community volunteering or volunteering virtually. So sometimes folks are like, well, I can't go to like the animal shelter and volunteer 4 hours a week. But what you might be able to do is volunteer online to help them write grants to get money, or you might be able to help them with their social media online. So even if you can't physically get to somewhere to volunteer, you might still be able to find a way to volunteer virtually, or sort of on demand, where you can be like, this is how much time I have this month, like where do you need me, that kind of thing. This is a great way to grow with your community and improve your social responsibility, even if it has nothing to do with your business. So maybe you have a food truck, but you volunteer at the dog shelter. Maybe you are a business consultant, but you plant trees on the weekends with the Sierra Club. These are great. It doesn't have to be tied into your business. If you can tie it into your business, even better, but you can't always. You also can think about corporate policies that benefit the environment. So for a large corporation, this is going to be maybe easier and more obvious. But even for small businesses, we can have policies that benefit the environment, like aiming to support our employees, for example, with transit cards so that they can take transit, or making sure that there's safe bike parking at the office. I had an office that I used to work in that had a shower so that people could bike in, shower, and then go to work. And that increased the percentage of people who were biking, because there's some people who were coming from 20 miles away couldn't bike 20 miles and then go straight to work. They had to shower. So having a shower at that office improved the multimodal travel opportunities. You could also have a bulletin board with carpooling opportunities. You can not have single-use plastic in your communal kitchen. You can have, like I said, fair trade organic coffee. You can have reusable napkins instead of throwaway paper towels. So there's just some things that we can think about and say, like, how can we benefit through our policies, even of our tiny business? How can we benefit the environment? How can we benefit our community? And one way that you can do this is by trying to purchase local materials. We already talked about like the quality of the materials or the certification of the materials, but something else that we can think about is trying to shift more of our purchasing to local companies. Like if you need paper, if you need envelopes. If you need coffee, can you get it from a local company rather than buying it from like Amazon or Office Depot? Now, this is probably further down the line for a lot of us, but we can also think about socially and environmentally conscious investments. So, if your business has investments, or even if you personally have investments, you can look for example, socially and environmentally conscious mutual funds that you can invest in that often have similar or possibly even better returns than some of the traditional programs. So thinking about where we're putting our money, and if we have extra money, is there a way to like put a grant back into the community, or put some money back into mutual aid in the community, etc. So your homework for this class is to make your socially responsible statement. And this would look like, my business is socially responsible because. And then I'd like you to list 3 different ways that your business is socially responsible or will try to be socially responsible. And think outside the box. Don't just think about like donating time, but think about your materials, think about your partnerships, think about how you get to work, etc., and see if you can find some ways to improve the social responsibility of your business.